Want to advertise your business in a cost-effective way? It's time to give podcast advertising a try. Research shows a high rate of podcast listeners made a purchase as a result of an ad they heard on a podcast. Visit podbean.com/brands to launch a cost-effective podcast advertising campaign in minutes. That's podbean.com/brands.
Lady Justice is a true crime podcast, therefore deals with incidents of violence, disturbing imagery and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised. The Lady Justice podcast wishes to offer their deepest condolences to the victims' families and wishes to offer thanks to those that work in emergency services. Hello my lovelies and welcome to Lady Justice, a true crime podcast. Lady Justice is a weekly podcast that covers fascinating cases, both past and present. My name is Chantal and I'm your friendly true crime junkie with slight caffeine addiction issues. I hope everybody is doing incredibly well and getting ready for Christmas. As usual, before I get into this week's episode, I just want to ask you guys a massive favour. Please support this podcast by subscribing, rating and leaving a review where you can. And because sharing is caring, I do want you to go tell everyone you know, share it on social media and get the word out. It makes the world of difference. If you would like to contact me about anything at all, please feel free to do so via social media or my email, which you'll find in the show notes. Now, I might be slightly merry right now because Christmas is just a few sleeps away. I am literally a Christmas elf. I am so excited. And I just want to wish everybody the happiest of holidays. Be merry, spend time with those that you care about, and enjoy yourself. Remember to stay safe out there. Now, everybody does struggle sometimes, and this season tends to bring us memories, good and bad. If you're having a bit of a rough time, I just want to remind you that it's okay to be not okay. It's also okay just to reach out. My inbox is always open, as are many others. There are helplines provided in the show notes too, so please don't ever think you're alone, no matter the time of year. It was a white Christmas in 1938, but for the Key family, it was marred by tragedy. A robbery gone wrong had left a man dead, and all that was left of the killer was his bowler hat. His motive? To buy two little girls a Christmas present. So, without further ado, here's some background on the location and the time frame of this crime. We're heading back to the December of 1938. The King was George VI, and the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was dealing with the first rumblings of World War II. It was also the year that saw the first Beano comic launched, and BBC Television airing their first crime drama, aptly called Telecrime. We are off to Surbiton in southwest London, though at the time of this crime it was part of Kingston upon Thames, in the county of Surrey. Surbiton is mostly known for being the home of suburban bliss in the sitcom The Good Life. Famous residents have included ex-England football manager Roy Hodgson, comedian Andy Parsons, and the British-Canadian journalist Lucan Johnson, who after interviewing Adolf Hitler, mysteriously disappeared. As always, all my sources will be listed in the show notes, so let's get on it like a car bonnet. It was a chilly start to Christmas Eve in 1938. The UK had been subjected to a brutal winter with heavy snow coming across from Scandinavia. That Saturday morning was no different, with inches of snow blanketing the streets of Surbiton. Just before 11:30 that morning, Jack Key, a mineral water manufacturer, met his sister and started to walk to see their father in his jeweller's shop. When they arrived, however, they found everything was locked up. Returning shortly after, they used a key that they had retrieved from their family home in nearby Ewell Road. Opening the door into the workshop, they found their father laid in a pool of blood, his head towards the door. Jack called out to his father, but to hear no response. He noticed a large gash just above the left eye of his father and went to call for an ambulance immediately. When paramedics arrived, they found that the 64-year-old jeweller and Mr. Ernest Percival Key was still alive, but barely. The man was saturated in his own blood and was quickly placed in an ambulance bound for Kingston County Hospital. A journalist had been passing the shop when they heard the scream and commotion and ran to give assistance. When he arrived, he asked the shop owner's children what had happened. Jack then told the journalist that he had found his dad laid on the floor and believed that he must have fallen and hit his head on the gas stove, as he had a big cut on his head. Ernest's children were distraught. His daughter ran home to inform their mother, and Jack followed the ambulance. It was not how they had expected to spend their Christmas Eve. By the time Ernest Key arrived at the hospital, he was pronounced dead by Dr. Day, and then the gruesome reality of what happened to the well-known and well-liked man came to light. Police were called after doctors at the hospital had undressed Ernest to find his body covered in numerous slashes and stab wounds. They had not been obvious when he was first discovered, due to the blood that had saturated his clothing and hair. Investigations began instantly. It seemed utterly strange that in a time we say goodwill to all men, that a man should be so grievously attacked. The shop at 74 Victoria Road, Surbiton, was sealed off, and officers started by looking into the victim's life. Ernest Percival Key was a prominent member of the local community. He was born in Hull, Yorkshire, and had lived in the Surrey town for 22 years before his death. At the age of 64, he lived with his wife and son, Jack, and owned the shop in which his business was conducted. He was a respected member of the Freemasons and highly active in the Surbiton Lodge. He had planned to work a full day at his shop, hoping to catch the last-minute gift buyers. Leaving his home at 9:20 that morning after breakfast with his family, he walked slowly the 1 mile distance. After opening the front shop space, he retired to the back room, his workshop, and made a telephone call home. It was 10:30 in the morning, and he called his wife to let her know that the conditions outside were bad. The man had fallen a few times on his short journey, and he knew his wife was going shopping, so wished to ask her to take care. He told her that he wasn't hurt, and they laughed at his embarrassment of falling on his bottom. Ernest was just one of those kinds of people. He laughed at himself. He was reliable, and he tried to be kind to all. He was well-to-do, comfortable and modest, with lots of friends and family, who, after hearing of the news of his passing, spoke how it was a terrible loss, and how he would be missed. At the scene, police examined the shop and workroom to find very little evidence of a struggle. It was clear that the encounter between the victim and murderer had happened in the workroom. Generally, everything was tidy, and the only evidence something horrific had happened was the large amount of blood that could be seen on the floor. The many clocks that were hung on the wall, chirping like crickets on a warm evening, were also splattered with blood. 2 pathologists came to the scene of the crime. Dr. Eric Gardner, who was the county pathologist for Surrey, and the famous Sir Bernard Spilsbury, on behalf of Scotland Yard. Ernest Key's son was let into the room to help determine what, if any, items were missing. Jack said that all that he could account to being missing was his father's blue overcoat, and a few items to be sold were also gone. After detectives checked over the business ledgers, they confirmed that Jack was correct, and £15 in notes, a gold watch, a chain, and a silver baby's rattle had in fact been taken. The police suspected that there had been a quarrel between the robber and Ernest when the shopkeeper had walked in on the burglary. They questioned the son on whether he knew if his father had dealt with stolen goods before. Jack denied this, stating that his father was a respectable man and they could ask anybody and they would testify to that fact. Jack also did notice something at the scene that didn't belong there: a large bowler hat. The post-mortem was carried out on Boxing Day, the 26th of December, at Kingston County Hospital by Dr. Gardner. He later testified at the coroner's inquest to the cause of death. I think it will cover everything if I just give you the cause of death now. The cause of death was hemorrhage from multiple wounds of the head, associated with cerebral hemorrhage due to violence. There were a total of 31 stab wounds to the face and neck, and Ernest Key's forearms were slashed. This suggested that he had tried to defend himself. There was no doubt in the minds of those working on the case. This was definitely murder. Appeals and doorstep inquiries led to a few promising leads. The police wanted to speak to a woman who was dressed in grey who had entered the shop at 11 a.m. on the morning of the murder. She'd confirmed that Key was still alive at this point, as he had come to serve her. The window of time for the murder had been established. It was sometime between 11 and 11:30 a.m. A garage owner that worked down the road had told police that he had gone into the shop between this time. He said that he was waiting at the front part of the shop, looking at the cabinet containing some rings, when he could hear some noises coming from the back room. This being said, they did not sound suspicious, and he soon left after he thought Mr. Key was too busy. As in most situations like this, there are always leads that seem more obscure. There are people that tend to jump on the bandwagon and insert themselves into investigations. Ernest was a self-proclaimed spiritualist and attended a local group of like-minded individuals. When it became known that the police believed Key to have been murdered, they stepped forward to help in the best way they knew how. Local mediums reported to officers that they had spoken to Key's personal spirit guide, Assam. One said that on Christmas Day he heard Assam say, "Do not go into the shop." No one was quite sure why the guide had got the day wrong. Another medium had claimed that Assam had spoken to them to pass on a message from Key himself. "Take care of Mother, everything will be alright." Scotland Yard detectives, who mainly used solid evidence, did ask the group, however, if Assam had a message about who the murderer was. They replied that they were still awaiting a response to that question. Evidence had come back from a Dr. Lynch stating that some of the blood scrapings that had been taken on Christmas Eve had come back with 2 blood types, one of which was the victim's, leading the other to be safely assumed to be that of the attacker. Police then spread out amongst the many hospitals, doctors' offices and chemists in the area, looking for anyone who had come in on the day of the attack with a blade-inflicted injury. In the detailed ledger at the Kingston County Hospital, they struck it lucky. There was an entry, Charles Jackson, injuries to the hands, self-inflicted accidentally with a wood saw. There was an address next to it, however it did turn out to be false. This led police to believe they had in fact found their man. The house surgeon on duty that shift was Dr. Day, the same man who had declared Ernest Key dead on arrival at the same hospital. He was asked if he could remember the man from the ledger, and he said that he'd come in less than an hour after Key was brought in, and that he had a clear memory of him. I remember him for 2 reasons. He had pulled his gloves on over the injuries, and that seemed a silly thing for anybody to do. Also, he had a new bowler hat that was much too small for him. Asked how he knew it was a new hat, the doctor grinned and said he'd left the price tag in it. Inquiries were then made at the many shops that sold hats. Now, at the time, that was pretty much everywhere because they were the staple of men's fashion. Focusing in on the immediate area around the scene of the crime, they found the shop they'd been looking for. The manager of a gentleman's outfitters on Eden Street, Kingston. I remember him. He was in such a hurry that he positively snatched up the hat. I told him it was too small for him, but he wouldn't heed me. He kept his gloves on and even fumbled for his money. They were stiff and blackened. I thought it was tar, but it was blood. He'd kept the taxi waiting. The officers were making progress. They then began to track down the taxi driver in one of the many shelters in Kingston. They found the cabbie, who recalled the man. "Yeah, I remember the bloke. He had a blue overcoat on and was carrying another coat. I drove him to Richmond and he went into a public lavatory. Naturally, I thought he was sick or something. A bit too much drink maybe. Christmas, you know." The cab driver then took the strange man to Kingston Hospital, which then matched the doctor's statement. 2 officers were sent to the toilet and discovered a blood-stained, well-worn grey overcoat rolled up and stuffed behind the toilet flush. As this was all happening, more forensic evidence was coming from the labs run by Dr. Lynch. Examining the bowler hat that had been found at the scene, they unearthed some hairs. This was all helping investigators build an image to who the perpetrator may be. So far, they had ascertained that he was a well-built man from the size of the coat found at the public bathroom. They knew his blood type and had logically deducted the size of his head from the bowler hat. The hair inside gave a further piece of the puzzle. They were looking for a man between the ages of 25 and 30, with light brown hair that was slightly wavy. Several witnesses came forward saying they saw the suspected murderer come from the shop. He was a shabbily dressed man with dark hair and a ruddy complexion, pale skin with sensitive features. Chief Inspector William Parker of Scotland Yard made a statement 6 days after the murder. "On December 30th, I arrested William Thomas Butler and charged him with the willful murder of Ernest Percival Key. On the same day, he appeared at the Kingston Petty Sessions and was remanded in custody until January 6th. The man that had been arrested was done so after being spotted by Constable George Maudsley. He worked at the Teddington police station and had been on alert for the man after Scotland Yard issued his description. He informed his superiors of the man and noted how he had recognised him as a Teddington resident. William Thomas Butler was 29 years old, married with 2 young daughters, and lived on Laurel Road just 3 miles away from the jewellers. He had recently lost his job as a motor driver, and when detectives checked his arrest record, they found that he had previous for housebreaking. His arrest came after he'd been seen drinking in a local pub with neighbours. The constable noted how he had been seen wearing the blue overcoat and a too small bowler hat. That evening, on the information given by the officer, the chief inspector of the flying squad halted his car outside the small home. An officer went to the back of the property and one stayed to the front. After a knock, a minute passed. Then a half-dressed man came out to the doorway. Noticing who was there, he turned as white as a ghost and whispered, "Please, my girls are upstairs." The detectives quietly placed the handcuffs on the man and took him to the station. Once there, he squirmed, denying that he had any involvement in the murder of Mr. Key. When asked of his injuries to his hands, he claimed that he'd come off a motorcycle. Furthermore, he said that when he was at the hospital, the reason he had given for a fake name and address was that he could not afford the fees. Because before the UK had the NHS, we had to pay for our medical care. Investigators were taking a deep look into the suspect's life. They had visited his mother's at her lodgings and she recalled the Christmas Eve. She had seen her son and he had been hurt that day in a bicycle accident. She was given a silver baby rattle by Butler and he said that although he was covered in blood, he had been to the hospital and everything was well. She also remembered that he had 2 presents for his fair-haired daughters. William, over the past few months, had been worried about what he should do for the girls over Christmas. Due to his unemployment, he didn't know if he could treat them, especially as one of the girls had recently had a lengthy hospital stay. He smiled as he said goodbye to his mum, proud at getting his little princesses something special. As the stories did not match about how Butler came to be hurt, the police leading the interviews decided to put a bit more pressure on him, because How could you get the same set of injuries from a woodcutting machine, a motorcycle accident, and a pedal bike accident? He was placed before a number of notable witnesses who had come forward during the early days of the investigation. Police wanted to see if they could identify the man that they had seen on the day. A pawnbroker who had come forward agreed that Butler was the man that had come into his shop and pawned a gold chain and watch. He also recalled that at the time the man had come into his shop, he still had several pound notes in his wallet. Butler quickly altered his story when he realised there were too many witnesses that had seen him leave the shop. He then declared a man, whom he did not know but identified himself as Detective Reeves, had kidnapped him on Christmas Eve. He was then forced to drive to Surbiton. The detective was the one who had gone into the shop and then come out in another coat. The policeman then forced Butler to drive him to a lonely road where he was made to get out and put on the detective's clothing. Butler said that this unknown Detective Reeves then ran him over, and that's why he had cuts on his hand. Not believing a word coming from the young man's mouth, they charged him. Whilst all this was happening, which was in a matter of hours, the Butler girls were playing with their new porcelain dolls that they had been given off their father. The trial of William Thomas Butler began on Wednesday the 15th of February 1939 at the Old Bailey in London. Overseeing the case was Mr. Justice Singleton, and the jury was sworn in. The Crown's prosecution was led by Mr. G.B. McClure, and opened with speculation of motive, in how the defendant had planned to rob the shop, and when confronted, launched a senseless and deadly attack on the much older defenceless man. Witnesses that had come forward during the police investigation testified to seeing the man in the dock running from the scene. Evidence was produced by the pathologist who had conducted the post-mortem and police officers that had helped tracing the man. Butler's defence team claimed that the charge facing Butler should have only been manslaughter, defended by Mr. David Maxwell Fyfe, King's Counsel, who would later go on to be Solicitor General, and then in 1951 the Home Secretary. Butler claimed that he was actually acting in self-defence. In a very different story from what he had told police, Butler testified whilst on the stand to how he had called upon Key in the shop after they made a previous arrangement. He had been unemployed for some time and often sold the spoils of his robberies to Key in exchange for small payments, and this was such on that day. The 29-year-old said how he had gone to pick up the £15 owed to him, but when he arrived, Key began a torrent of abuse at him and then refused to give up the cash. Although the exchange was heated, he said that he had not raised a hand to the man, until Key grabbed a knife and lunged at him. Butler then said he disarmed the man, and in a fit of rage, unable to stop himself from seeing red, he buried the knife into the man's flesh. When he came back to, he saw the bloodied figure on the floor and panicked. He then emptied the shopkeeper's pockets of money and picked up some jewellery, but only enough to cover the debt owed to him before realising he was soaked in the victim's blood. He then took the overcoat and left the jeweller's. Butler's defence cross-examined Jack Key, the victim's son, and asked him aggressively to the rumour that his father had previously been in trouble in 1938 for stolen rings to the total of 15 shillings being found in the shop. Jack said that he did not recall such an incident and that his father would have not dealt in such underhand activities. This may be the shortest trial I have come across. The judge began summing up the very next day after opening. As the defendant Butler sat quietly in his cell awaiting what the retired jury would announce to his future, his thoughts were of his two little girls and what would become of them. The time he had to dwell on these thoughts was short though, and he was called back into the courtroom just 15 minutes later. As the foreman stood and pronounced the verdict of guilty, he heard his wife weep from the gallery. He then watched intently as the judge donned the black cap and sentenced him to death. Determined not to give up, and with the help of his solicitor, Mr. Maxwell Fyfe, his wife Evelyn, and a friend, Mr. George Ernest Thurlow, an appeal was launched with the Court of Criminal Appeal on the 24th of February 1939. The hearing took place on the 14th of March, a fortnight before the proposed execution, and consisted of 3 judges. Justices Hawke, Humphreys and Hilbery heard the defence's case, stating that the appeal should be granted due to the failures of Mr. Justice Singleton during his summing up. Defect proposed by the defence was that during the end of the trial, the judge had not put forward the defence well enough, and the question of premeditation was not really examined. The appeal was dismissed without hearing evidence from the Crown, with Justice Hawke saying that the opinion of the court was the judge had dealt well in the trial, and there was no reason for them to intervene. He claimed that the victim was found with multiple injuries inflicted with some force, and that some of these had come from behind, meaning the conviction should stand. Although many were not bothered in the fate of the convicted murderer, his sister still campaigned on his behalf, writing to the then Home Secretary Sir Samuel Hoare, wishing for a pardon on the sentence and for it to be commuted to a prison sentence. Vera Butler visited inmates at various prisons in an attempt to get them to testify evidence to back the defence's theories, and although that she had hope, the plan never really came to fruition. On the 27th of March, she received a letter from the officers in Parliament that would bring an end to the appeals. There was no evidence that this case was anything other than willful, callous murder, and the sentence should be carried out in 2 days' time. Wednesday, 29th of March, saw William Thomas Butler step up to the gallows. He was bound, a hood placed over his head, and a noose around his neck by Tom Phillips, before the executioner, Tom Pierpoint, released the trapdoor. Butler's young wife Evelyn made headlines not long after her husband's death. Reported in the Daily Express with the headline, "2-month widow of murderer is to marry again." The single mother had fallen for her much older friend who helped her launch the appeal, Mr. Thurlow. The 2 little Butler girls were never told of their father's crimes. After his arrest, his daughters were told that their father had gone to join the army in a bid to help the war effort. It was common of these times that issues such as these were not to be spoken about around children, and they actually believed their father died in the First Battle of 1939. Even until the mid-1950s, as young mothers themselves, it was reported in the Aberdeen Evening Express by a guest writer, ex-detective Robert Fabian, that the girls still did not know of their father's deadly deeds or fate. The knife used in the attack that was discovered at Butler's home address when he was arrested was kept after being used as evidence in his trial. Eventually, the blade was put on display at Scotland Yard's Black Museum. The shop in which Mr. Key lost his life still stands today and is still used as a retail space. So that is the end of this week's rather gruesome tale. I think it's time to balance the scales a little bit and make the world a slightly nicer place for everyone, with a small act of kindness. Those that work in emergency services are the everyday heroes in our lives. The job is constant and they sacrifice so much of their lives for others. This Christmas, remember those that are on duty keeping us safe. Pop down to your local fire or police station, or hit up the front desk at an A&E near you. Have a thank you card at the ready and some sealed treats, such as a tin of Quality Street or some fancy biscuits that the staff can share. If you have little humans, take them along too. And with that, go be good people, go be kind, go be safe, and most importantly, go be happy.